5:18 a.m. Persian Gulf, 54 nautical miles southwest of Bandar Abbas. Iranian boats just departed a coastal staging area on a bearing toward a U.S. Navy task group operating in the central Persian Gulf. 13 vessels, 3 distinct elements, moving at different speeds on different bearings that convergence geometry analysis indicated were designed to arrive at the task group's outer perimeter within a 6-minute window of each other. The task group, built around the amphibious assault ship USS Bataan and consisting of the Bataan plus 2 guided missile destroyers and 1 coastal patrol ship, had 19 minutes before the first element reached challenge range. Aircraft launched from the carrier deck 47 nautical miles south. Welcome to Navy Strikeforce. Today we're going inside the 162 minutes that followed that launch order. 162 minutes in which the largest coordinated Iranian boat approach against a U.S. amphibious task group in recent years, a carrier deck launch that put 4 aircraft airborne within 11 minutes, and a defensive response that protected the most vulnerable surface combatant type in the U.S. Navy's Gulf inventory, revealed how Iranian doctrine has specifically adapted to exploit the operational characteristics of amphibious assault ships in ways that the standard carrier escort defense framework does not fully address. This is what defending an amphibious task group looks like. Not a carrier, not a destroyer. A ship designed to carry Marines and their equipment. Large, slow, and carrying a defensive armament designed for a different threat environment than the one she was operating in. To understand why an amphibious assault ship represents a specifically attractive target for Iranian fast boat doctrine, you need to understand the operational profile of an LHD class vessel in the Persian Gulf, and how that profile differs from the carriers and destroyers that receive most of the tactical analysis attention. The USS Bataan is a WASP-class amphibious assault ship, 844 feet long, displacing approximately 40,500 tons fully loaded, with a maximum speed of approximately 22 knots. She carries the 26th Marine Expeditionary Unit, the helicopters, V-22 Ospreys, and amphibious assault vehicles required to project Marine Corps power ashore. In the context of Gulf operations, the Bataan represents a major concentration of combat power, but her defensive armament reflects her designed role as an amphibious platform rather than a surface combatant. She carries 2 RAM rolling airframe missile, close-in air defense launchers, 2 Phalanx CIWS systems, and several .50 0-caliber mounts. She does not carry an Aegis combat system. She does not carry SM-2 or SM-3 missiles. Her defensive architecture is designed for close-in protection against air threats. It is not optimized for coordinated, multi-axis, fast boat approach at the scale the Iranian formation represented. The 2 guided missile destroyers in the task group, the USS Stout and the USS Bulkley, provided the Aegis air defense coverage that the Bataan lacked. But an amphibious task group's defensive geometry presents a problem that a carrier strike group's geometry does not. An aircraft carrier's primary value is its air wing, the aircraft that can be launched to project power and conduct defensive operations. When a carrier is threatened, the carrier's response capability is above the threat, not beside it. An amphibious assault ship's primary value is on her flight deck and in her well deck, assets that operate at low altitude and close range. When the Bataan needed defensive support, that support had to come from outside the task group because the Bataan's own aviation assets were V-22s, helicopters, and Harriers optimized for amphibious operations, not fleet air defense. The carrier, the USS George Washington, operating 47 nautical miles south in the Gulf of Oman approach, was the source of the defensive aviation that the task group needed. And at 5:18 a.m., the question was how quickly that aviation could reach the task group. The launch order reached the George Washington's flight deck at 5:19 a.m. 4F A-18C Hornets from Carrier Air Wing 7 were on deck alert, not airborne, but at launch readiness, engines capable of starting within 2 minutes. The first aircraft was airborne at 5:26 a.m., 7 minutes from launch order to wheels up. The second aircraft was airborne at 5:27 a.m. The third and fourth aircraft followed at 5:28 a.m. and 5:29 a.m. 4 aircraft airborne in 10 minutes from the initial launch order. At the standard distance from the task group, their transit time to the contact area would be approximately 8 minutes. Total time from Iranian approach detection to aircraft on station, 19 minutes. The first Iranian element would reach challenge range in 19 minutes. The margin was measured in seconds. Now, consider what the task group commander aboard the Bataan was managing between 5:18 a.m. and 5:37 a.m. The 19 minutes between detection and aircraft arrival. The Stout and Bulkley had immediately taken their positions on the approach bearings of the 3 Iranian elements as soon as the contact report was confirmed at 5:20 a.m. The Stout moved to block the approach of the eastern element, a group of 6 boats approaching from the northeast. The Bulkley moved to position against the western element, a group of 5 boats approaching from the northwest. The third element, 2 boats approaching from almost directly north on the most direct bearing to the Bataan, was left for the task group commander to address with the Bataan's own defensive systems. 2 boats on a direct bearing. The Bataan's phalanx systems could address them if they reached close range. The ram launchers could address them at the outer edge of the engagement envelope. But addressing 2 fast boats with close-in defense weapons while the Stout and Bulkley were tied up on the flank elements left no margin for a 4th element that intelligence had not yet identified. The task group commander's primary concern, which he transmitted to 5th Fleet at 5:22 a.m., was precisely this. With the Stout and Bulkley committed to the eastern and western elements and the Bataan's organic defenses addressing the northern element, the task group had no reserve defensive element for any contacts that appeared after the formation was committed. The coastal patrol ship, the USS Firebolt, was the 4th vessel in the task group. She was 334 tons. She had one 25mm chain gun. 5th Fleet acknowledged the concern and transmitted updated guidance at 5:24 a.m. The Firebolt was to position herself at the task group's southern flank, the only unguarded bearing, and report any contacts on that bearing immediately. Simultaneously, 5th Fleet requested additional aviation from the George Washington. 2 more FA-18S to supplement the 4 already launched, providing the task group commander with a reserve aviation element to address a 4th contact axis if one materialized. The additional 2 aircraft were airborne at 5:31 a.m. The 4 lead aircraft arrived over the contact area at 5:37 a.m., simultaneously with the first Iranian element reaching challenge range on the Stout's bearing. The eastern 6-boat element was at 3.8 nautical miles from the Stout when the 4 FA-18Cs established their orbit overhead. 2 aircraft positioned over the Stout's bearing, 2 over the Bulkley's. The aircraft arrival did not immediately break the approach. The eastern element held its bearing and speed for 4 additional minutes after the aircraft arrived, closing from 3.8 nautical miles to 2.4 nautical miles, while the overhead aircraft established their orbit patterns and the Iranian boat commanders assessed the situation. 2.4 nautical miles is within effective weapons range for the heavy machine guns that IRGCN fast attack craft typically carry. It is not a comfortable range, but it is not a legally definitive hostile act. The boats had not fired. They had not displayed weapons. They were simply at 2.4 nautical miles in international waters on a bearing toward a U.S. Navy surface combatant. The Stout's commanding officer requested engagement authorization for warning shots at 5:41 a.m. The request was transmitted to 5th Fleet immediately. 5th Fleet's response at 5:42 a.m. authorized warning shots from the Stout's Mark 38 25mm chain gun in accordance with standing rules of engagement provisions for surface vessels approaching to within 2 nautical miles of a U.S. Navy warship without responding to repeated warnings. The Stout fired a 3-second warning burst across the bow of the lead eastern element boat at 5:43 a.m. Geysers of 25mm water impact columns erupted 150 meters ahead of the lead boat. The lead boat altered course immediately. Hard right turn, speed reducing from 40 knots. The other 5 boats in the eastern element began reducing speed and altering course within 30 seconds of the lead boat's maneuver. The western element, the 5 boats on the Bulkley's bearing, had been watching the eastern element approach play out on their own bridge displays. When the warning shots fired and the eastern element broke off, the western element began its own course changes within 90 seconds. The northern element, 2 boats on direct bearing to the Bataan, held course for an additional 2 minutes and 40 seconds after the eastern element broke. They closed from 3.1 nautical miles to 2.0 nautical miles before altering course and reducing speed at 5:48 a.m. By 5:51 a.m., all 13 Iranian vessels were on opening courses. No additional vessels had appeared on the Firebolt's southern bearing. The 4th contact axis had not materialized. The aircraft maintained their orbit over the contact area for an additional 31 minutes before returning to the George Washington. The Bataan Task Group continued its patrol without further incident. The post-incident assessment produced findings specifically focused on the Amphibious Task Group defensive framework, analysis that was distributed to all commands with Amphibious Task Group operating requirements in high-threat environments. The primary finding addressed the 19-minute gap between detection and aircraft arrival. The 4 aircraft deck alert had launched in 10 minutes and transited in 8, a total of 18 minutes from detection to station, arriving simultaneously with the first element's challenge range arrival. The margin had been approximately 60 seconds. The assessment identified that the 19-minute detection to station timeline was at the absolute edge of what the current configuration could achieve. If the George Washington had been 5 nautical miles further south of the task group's position at the time of the incident, the transit time would have increased by approximately 1 minute, pushing the aircraft arrival to 20 minutes after the first element had already reached challenge range. If the Iranian approach had been at 44 knots rather than the observed 40 knots, the first element would have reached challenge range in 17 minutes rather than 19, before the aircraft could have arrived. 2 knots, 4 miles. The difference between aircraft arriving simultaneously with the threat and aircraft arriving after it. The assessment recommended that amphibious task groups operating in high-threat Gulf sectors maintain a standing fighter combat air patrol orbit at a distance calibrated to provide a 15-minute response time from any direction, rather than the deck alert posture that had provided 19 minutes in optimal conditions on this occasion. The standing CAP requirement would increase aviation maintenance and fuel demands on the carrier significantly, particularly for multi-week Gulf operations. The operational cost was assessed and accepted by the commands involved. The second finding addressed the warning shots. The Stout's commanding officer had made the correct decision in requesting authorization and had received it within 1 minute, a command chain response time that the assessment characterized as excellent. The warning shots had been effective in breaking the eastern element and, by visible example, in convincing the western element to break off before receiving similar treatment. But the 2.4 nautical mile engagement distance at which the warning shots had been fired was assessed as further inside the challenge range than the standing tactical guidance recommended. The guidance called for warning measures at 3.0 nautical miles for vessels not responding to communications. The eastern element had been at 3.8 nautical miles when the aircraft arrived and had continued closing for 4 additional minutes before warning shots were fired. The 4 minutes between aircraft arrival and warning shots had allowed the eastern element to close from 3.8 to 2.4 nautical miles, inside the recommended challenge distance, while the Stout's commanding officer waited for the aircraft presence alone to break the approach. The eastern element's commander had assessed that aircraft overhead, by themselves, were not sufficient reason to break off. He had held his bearing until the warning rounds were in the water. That assessment, by the Iranian boat commander, was itself a data point. It documented that IRGCN fast attack craft operating in coordinated approaches would not break off from aircraft overhead alone. That actual weapons employment Even warning shots was required to force a course change at the distances this element had been willing to reach. The guidance was revised to authorize warning measures at the first failure to respond to verbal warnings, rather than waiting for the aircraft presence phase to fail. The revision reduced the distance at which warning shots would be fired, increasing the response margin available between warning shots and the point at which lethal engagement would be authorized. The 13 Iranian boats had been broken off. The Bataan and her task group had continued their mission. The 26th Marine Expeditionary Unit aboard was unaware of the confrontation that the Stout and Bulkley had managed, while the Bataan held course. That is the nature of naval escort operations. The ships doing the protecting do the work. The ships being protected do the mission. The protection had worked on this occasion, but the warning shots had been necessary, and the distance at which they had been necessary was further inside challenge range than the guidance intended. The next approach by an IRGCN element, willing to hold course until weapons fire would find a different guidance in place, one that authorized the shot sooner. Stay sharp, stay informed. This is Navy Strikeforce. We'll see you in the next one.